Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. Hope everyone is doing well. We have with us today a special guest all the way from Abu Dhabi. And I'm going to read her bio and then I'm going to pass the baton. So Deborah Williams is Clinical Associate Professor of Literature and Creative Writing at NYU Abu Dhabi. In her academic work, she writes about feminist theory, women's writing, children's literature, and literary historiography. Her essays about everything from parenthood to therapy have appeared in various publications, including Brevity, The Rumpus, Motherwell, Dorothy Parker's Ashes, which is like a great name, but anyway, and the New York Times. At NYUAD, she regularly teaches courses on monsters, children's literature, global women's writing, and dystopias. So that is it. I have known Deb for a lot of years, from back in the NYU New York days of a long time ago. And I know her husband even better. And I'm really excited that Deb is here today, and I'm excited to be listening and participating. I think it'll be lots of fun. So I'm gonna let Deb take it away, and of course we'll have some time for questions and discussions at the end.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Yes, we've known each other for a long time, but that's because we met when we were 3, since we're actually still both in our 20s. So don't get any ideas about us being oldish or on the margins of old. I was just telling to somebody, I am planning to stay in my very late mid-40s until I turn 60. It's just going to be like the long 18th century. It's just going to be the long mid-40s. So hello, everybody. Welcome, or thank you for having me, Karen. It's great to get a chance to talk with you all. I don't know if you got a chance to look at the sort of proposal that I sent to Karen. It's for, maybe I'll share my screen. Let's see if this will work. This is for a series that is put out by Oxford University Press. Called the Literary Agenda, and it's they're trying to bridge between sort of an academic book and a trade book, right? They're short books, it's about 60,000 words, and they're meant to be very readable. They're meant to be written in a very approachable language. They're supposed to spark conversations. And so what you see here on the screen, I hope, is the description from Oxford of this series of books. And they have things like, on the humanities, on reading, on, public writing, on all kinds of ways of thinking about literature, right? And when I was looking at this series, I started thinking about the fact that I am one of those old people who reads young adult literature all the time, right? And I teach courses on children's literature, and I write about it. And I have had more than one occasion where people say, oh, children's literature. And that's for those of you who are not that smart, that's great, good for you, right? But really, how, YA isn't important, it's just Twilight, it's just the Hunger Games, it's just Harry Potter, it's, it doesn't bear critical discussion. That's the sort of prevailing wisdom often in academic circles. It's changing, but that's the kind of knee-jerk response. And when I teach young adult literature and children's literature, one of the things that my students are always surprised about is, for many of them, the idea that the books they read sort of for fun before college could actually be in a classroom and be studied the way you might study, a Shakespeare play or Jane Eyre or, something else, that they were sort of important enough, quote unquote. That was always really surprising to my students. And I think that given the popularity of young adult fiction, given the fact that the audience for young adult fiction goes from, I have a niece who's 9 and she reads stuff that you might call young adult, and I am absolutely not 9 and I read it. So, these books are talking to a lot of people, right? And it seemed to me that it would be really useful to think about what the cultural work is that they're doing. Right? Why do they matter? Not necessarily to, I don't want to explain these books using theories. I want to show how the books that we can call young adult, I want to show how these books are actually helping us to think about things that are happening in our world, that they're giving us tools for conversation, even if we don't know it, right? That I'm not saying that the authors of these books are sitting down to say, well, now I will create an adventure story that highlights the problems of climate catastrophe. What I'm saying is that because writers exist in context, they exist in conversation with what's happening around them, those things make their way into these novels. And then we can think about how these novels in turn help us to think about the problems confronting us, right? So it's sort of a loop, right? The writers are existing in the world, they create these fictions, we can read these fictions, and then those fictions can help us think about and sort of untangle some of the more pressing problems confronting us in this early 21st century sort of existence. So this paragraph here, is the opening paragraph of the proposal. And one of my sort of academic intellectual interests are ideas of cosmopolitanism, right? Some of you might have read Kwame Anthony Appiah's book, Cosmopolitanism. It's David Hollinger has a book, Bruce Robbins. Cosmopolitanism is often talked about as a theory. And what I think we see in the books that I talk about in this project is that cosmopolitanism is actually a practice. It's a thing we have to get in the habit of doing. It's a worldview that might not come to us naturally. So we have to practice it, just like, so in, a small sidebar, people often talk about YA fiction and literature in general as teaching us empathy, that when we read, we learn about empathy. I'm not sure that's true. But I also think that empathy, like cosmopolitanism, is not innate. And as I was saying to Karen when we were talking last week, if any of you have ever spent time around little kids or in a children's playground, you will notice that small children are feral. They do not have empathy. They're not necessarily particularly kind. We have to teach them those things, right? And just the same with cosmopolitanism. It's really easy to look at people who are different and say, oh, we have nothing in common. Or to say, oh, we're all the same under the skin and our differences don't matter. And so we erase, right? That's the sort of two kind of points, I think, that often happen in a cosmopolitan, in ways of thinking about difference. What cosmopolitanism does is say, okay, we're different. We might be really different. You might be actually a bug or a monster. And there are probably things we can find to agree on, or that we can at least talk about. There's one of the books I talk about is Octavia Butler's classic novel called Parable of the Sower. I'll get to that in more detail in a minute, but one of the things that the heroine says to this group of people who kind of cohere around her, and they're mixed races, mixed ethnicities, economic diversity. Some of them have physical handicaps. There are all kinds of differences among them. And she says, well, okay, but here's the thing. We're going to agree that we're not going to eat each other. Like, there's going to be no cannibalism. That's our baseline. And the rest of the group's like, okay, we're not going to eat each other. It's a low bar, but it's a point of connection. And from that, we can then move forward. And cosmopolitanism allows us, as the screen says here, to think about difference as a strength, to think about diversity as what we need to survive. If any of you have spent time anywhere where farmers have only grown one crop, for instance, for generations, right? They ruin the land. They strip it of all of its nutrients, and then they have to pump pesticides into the fields to make it grow again, right? You need difference. You need diversity for strength. And that's one of the things that I think emerges over and over again in contemporary YA fiction. And it's something that I'm really interested in because it shows us, it kind of gives us tools with which we can practice, right? That's maybe a good way to think about it, right? All of the books that I'm talking about deal with monsters, right? I love monsters. I teach a class on monsters. And Donna Haraway has a really important essay from the early 90s called A Cyborg Manifesto. And she's talking a lot about cyborgs and about feminism and about otherness. And what she points out is, I say here, that it is at the point of monster that we see the limits of community, right? That the people who aren't us are monsters, right? There's a sort of a dividing line, right? And yet, if you've done any reading in monsters, if you've read Frankenstein or Twilight or Parable of the Sower or even the Hunger Games, the monster is often us. And that's ultimately the thing that becomes the most terrifying, because we like to think that there's a really clear dividing line between us and them. I am not a monster, that's a monster. And what happens when those barriers break down? What happens when we can't carefully wall off or segment ourselves from things that are different from us, all right? And that is over and over again in the books that I'm talking about. What we see are ways in which monsters and monstrosity actually become, if we can learn to accept the monster, what it does is offer us a point where the community can be not fixed. These aren't necessarily books with happy endings, but can move towards something more robust and also something that shifts the perspective in narrative from humans as the center of the story to humans as just nodes in a network, right? If you want to think about sort of climate catastrophe and environmentalism, one of the problems, right, is that for centuries, humans have thought of themselves as the center and at the apex of a kind of resource pyramid, right? And I'm talking human society, mostly Western, mostly post-Enlightenment, mostly male, but right, that the earth exists for us. And what these books do, what they show us, is actually we need to flatten out that narrative and start to see the ways in which actually we're not at the center of the story. And if we persist in seeing ourselves at the center of the story, we're doomed, right? We have to learn to realign, right? And the word I use, this is on the screen here, the word I use in the book is to think about affiliation rather than biology, that people choose their community, their friends, their companions, where they live, how they live, rather than the default being sort of, oh, well, you're my family, we're connected by biology, so you have to be my people and I have to abide by these sets of stories, right? So the affiliated or the communities of affiliation in the novels that I talk about, with the exception of Harry Potter, and we'll get to that in just a minute, the communities of affiliation bring in, as I say here, hybridity, multiplicity, heterogeneity, monstrosity, the human and the non-human, both in terms of magic creatures, clones, human bodies. There's one of the books by a woman named Rebecca Roanhorse ends with one of the characters has wings, locusts wings attached to his back. So he's, kind of an insect. So thinking about how we can move from this sort of hierarchical set of relationships into a flatter, more horizontal set of relationships is also one of the sort of things that I'm going to be talking about in this book, and that I think that YA often demonstrates to us in really, really creative ways. Right. And before I go forward and talk more specifically about the books, I will say that I see YA fiction not just as this kind of tool, right? This kind of theoretical or political tool. I also think that in terms of aesthetics, in terms of style, in terms of craft, there is really, really exciting work happening in this space that makes it also a pleasure. And I think that reading and a sort of a life lived with literature is also about pleasure, right? They're exciting, they're engaging, they're creative, they are frequently beautiful on the level of the sentence, right? So I want to make clear that I don't just see this as a kind of, didactic task, right? That there is also, if I may paraphrase, pleasure in the text, right? So the first chapter starts with Harry Potter, because you can't write about YA in the 21st century without dealing with the juggernaut. And then also now, different from when I wrote the proposal, also with J.K. Rowling's, shall we say, less warm and fuzzy public statements about trans people and so forth. I haven't quite figured out how I'm going to tackle that, right? But there is something really interesting to think about the writer who's a human in the world, and what that person is doing and saying. And then these books, which have shaped the childhoods and young adulthoods and adulthoods of, millions upon millions upon millions of people, right? So I don't know, I can't see you all because I have this screen up, but I don't know how many of you have read Harry Potter. Can you make the little hand thingy? Yeah. Okay. How many of you have ever watched a Harry Potter movie? Okay, right. So he's, Harry is inevitable in a way, right? And so I teach at NYU Abu Dhabi, and the students there come from literally almost every country in the world. I think this year we have our first student ever from Fiji, which is the one country that hadn't been represented. So it's not uncommon in a first year course on children's literature to have, let's say, 20 students from 20 different countries speaking 20 different home languages, and but the languages of instruction is in English, and we read in English, and that's a whole conversation for another day, right, about the hegemonic structures of English. But so I have this group, this incredibly disparate group of people who went to different kinds of high schools. Some did A-level, some did IB, some did, the South Asian Indian curriculum, some did AP American curriculum, some did a Canadian curriculum, and they come from all kinds of traditions. Some of them have never, ever been asked to read fiction in school, ever. Some of them have never been asked to write a paper, an essay of more than 200 words, right? So we've got every, just so. But what happens is they all know Harry Potter. And so that also raises questions of translation, because some of them read Harry Potter because they were trying to learn English. Some of them read Harry Potter because everybody was talking about the Harry Potter movies. Some of them only seen Harry Potter. As a whole host of things. So I start my book talking about reading Harry Potter in Abu Dhabi because it is an example of what we might call a cosmopolitan reading practice. Here's this incredibly diverse group of people, and how do we find a way to talk to each other, right? Well, we can talk about Harry, we can talk about Hermione, we can talk about whether Hermione should have ended up with Ron. We can talk about the ending of the Deathly Hallows, which takes all the complexity of the books and flattens it into this heteronormative narrative that every time I read it makes me angrier. Or maybe we should have known from the ending where old JK was going. I don't know. So we start with Harry Potter as a way to think about cosmopolitan reading practice, about the juggernaut, about the marketing, about the readership, but also about the difference from Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which is really a children's book, right? It's resolved, it's a fairly straightforward plot, it's short, it's dark in that Harry has lost his parents, but it's not that dark. And by the time we get to Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, we're really in the realm of what we might call YA, right? Really dark, way too long, lots and lots of plots, lots and lots of loss, right? Death of the central character. Sorry, I hope that wasn't a spoiler. Sorry. So, so it also, as a setup, it gives me sort of an arc to talk about. And we go from there to a chapter called Our Monsters Ourselves. And I just wasn't sure, because these are US books, whether you would know them. So there are these two books here, Trail of Lightning and Storm of Locusts, and then Nancy Farmer, The Lord of Opium, and the House of Scorpion first, Lord of Opium. They're both set in the American Southwest. They're both set in a kind of post-apocalyptic landscape, environmental degradation. Both of them deploy sort of local myth and religion and legend. Rebecca Roanhorse is a member of the Diné of the Navajo. And so and it's set on what once was a Diné or Navajo reservation in the American Southwest. Lord of Opium is set in the border between the United States and Mexico, which, if any of you have read Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera, it's exactly that space, right? The heroine in the Roanhorse books is a monster because she has these clan powers. She turns into sort of a possessed quasi-demon. She's really, as she likes to say, she's really good at killing people. And in the Nancy Farmer books, the main character is a clone, which he doesn't discover until late in the first book. Complications ensue, right? So we've got monstrosity, we've got, they're monsters, but they look like us. How can you tell? Why does it matter if we know what's human and not what's not? And landscape and the way the monsters sort of find points of connection with those around them is part of what I'm trying to talk about there. Let's see. Raising the Spirits, Brown Girl in the Ring. Nayla Hopkinson is a Caribbean-Canadian writer. A Kata Witch and a Kata Warrior are both set in Nigeria. Nnedi Okorafor is Nigerian and based in Chicago. And in these books, Nayla Hopkinson's book is set in a post-apocalyptic Toronto. Karen, do you know this book? Have you read this? No? It's awesome. But in both of these, these texts, what I'm really interested in is the way the writers offer us modes of rethinking religion and spirituality, right? By taking what might be called folklore or legend and reanimating it in a contemporary and very environmentally focused direction. So I use, this will be familiar to you, Karen, Raymond Williams' idea, no relation, of emergence, right? Of that which is ancient can become emergent and fight and push against a dominant culture by being reanimated in a new context, right? We also have monstrosity, possession, There is also a theme running through these books about the ethics of organ donation, which intrigues me. So that, and then we have this series. So Butler's, she wrote 2 books never finished the third, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. Again, post-apocalyptic United States. There's a president in Parable of the Talents whose last name is Donner. Some of you might want to just look up on your friend, Mr. Google, the Donner Party, famous sort of 19th century frontier group that was going from, I think, Colorado to California, got trapped in the snow, and they maybe ate people. And so they have Parable of the Talents has President Donner, whose slogan is, I swear to you, make America great. All right, and she wrote it 25 years before Donald Trump was anybody. Anyway, so searching for community, questions of spirituality, but also An Aleph the Unseen by G. Willow Wilson, who some of you might know from the cartoon or the comic book called Ms. Marvel. Brilliant, funny. She also has a wonderful memoir called The Butterfly in the Butterfly Mosque about her time in Cairo. So Aleph the Unseen is set in an unnamed Gulf city. And there are homages to Star Wars and to Scooby-Doo and to Narnia and to Philip Pullman. But in all of these books, what is really important are books of prayer. In Aleph the Unseen, it's the demonic inverse of 1001 Nights that's been written by a jinn. So language, books, but also reading, and stressing the idea that if we don't learn how to become good readers, we cannot be responsible members of society, that we need to be open to multiple interpretations. We need to be open to the possibility that spirituality exists and we also need to be open to questions of faith in the books that we read, and to believe in the power of the books that we read. Right? All of the books that I'm talking about are vaguely dystopian science fiction or speculative fiction. And this is from Ursula Le Guin writing about Margaret Atwood, is that science fiction extrapolates from current trends to a near future that's half prediction and half satire. And the books I'm talking about are not necessarily satire, but I like this idea. It's something that Atwood also says, which is when people talk about her books about The Handmaid's Tale or Oryx and Crake, and people say, oh, well, that can't happen here. And Atwood's response is, oh, yes, it can. It already is happening here. You just haven't noticed. All right. So this idea that the books that I'm talking about look otherworldly, I think is actually to ignore much of what's already happening, right? So I think, is that, yeah, so that's the end of that. So I think I will stop sharing, there we go. I've been talking for a long